In the aftermath of Japan's defeat in 1945, the vast network of military bunkers, built to withstand invasion, fell into silence. These impregnable structures, designed with relentless determination, were left to decay in the Pacific's youngless end-islands, as the world shifted its focus to rebuilding. No longer needed for war, they became forgotten monuments to a past that no longer had a place in the New World Order. Slowly, nature reclaimed them, while the remnants of Japan's former power were either repurposed or forgotten. These concrete giants, abandoned and crumbling, stand as mute witnesses to the vast and the complex journey of a nation moving forward. As the war came to its crushing end in 1945, the landscape of the Pacific, forever altered by years of fighting, was left with an eerie stillness. On hundreds of remote islands, within dense jungles and on craggy cliffs, vast fortifications constructed by the Japanese Imperial Army were abandoned. These were not just military outposts, they were sprawling networks of concrete bunkers, tunnels, and hidden artillery emplacements, built with an uncompromising devotion to holding ground at any cost. Yet, within mere months of Japan's surrender, these structures, so vital in the years of conflict, were left to deteriorate. Across the Pacific, these abandoned bunkers stood as silent witnesses to the chaotic conclusion of the war. The scale of these fortifications was staggering. Over 400,000 soldiers, both Imperial Army and civilian laborers, had worked to create them. They were built to last, designed with enough firepower to fend off invasions for years. Yet, as the war came to an abrupt halt, the machinery of empire that had once filled these bunkers with life was gone, and what remained was a complex of reinforced concrete structures, devoid of purpose and now out of place in a peacetime world. This strange, lingering silence was soon to be shattered by the practicalities of the post-war world. With the Japanese surrender in September 1945, a new set of realities took hold. The Allied forces, tasked with occupying Japan and dismantling its military infrastructure, had no use for these structures. They were relics of an empire defeated and broken, their utility now virtually non-existent. With millions of men returning home, reconstruction underway, and the economic demands of a nation in ruin, the question of what to do with these abandoned bunkers became one of cold pragmatism. In the early days after the war, the bunkers were often left undisturbed, simply abandoned to the elements. In some cases, Allied forces used them for storage or as makeshift headquarters in the initial days of occupation. But as the months passed and the infrastructure of the Japanese state began to collapse further under the weight of economic destruction, it became clear that the bunkers were neither sustainable nor valuable to the new post-war government. The immediate concern was not these decaying structures, but how to stabilize the country's economy, rebuild cities, and ensure basic survival. The bunkers, then, became part of a larger dilemma: the difficulty of reconciling what to keep and what to discard in a world now looking forward, not backward. The Japanese government, grappling with the vast devastation of its cities and the daunting task of reconstruction, was far more focused on rebuilding essential infrastructure than on dealing with military remnants from a lost war. What followed was a slow, systematic abandonment. In some locations, the bunkers were left to crumble naturally under the unrelenting pressure of the elements. Storms, erosion, and the encroachment of plant life began to claim what human hands had once built. In places where the bunkers were not located in remote areas, it wasn't long before they were broken down, repurposed, or stripped for materials. The concrete was cracked, the iron reinforcements stripped away, and the once thriving military complex reduced to scrap. But there were also more deliberate efforts to remove these structures. In several key locations where the bunkers were seen as a threat to national security or a source of nationalist sentiment, authorities took immediate action to dismantle them. Some were simply blasted apart, leaving no trace of their existence, while others were abandoned to decay slowly, becoming little more than overgrown mounds of concrete in the jungle. The logic was cold. In a country that needed to embrace peace and rebuild, the reminders of past militarism could not remain. In their place, new structures, new symbols of the future, would take form. Yet, despite the efforts to erase them, many of the bunkers remained, hidden in plain sight. Some were rediscovered decades later, found by historians, curious adventurers, or local farmers. These remnants, untouched and forgotten, had a strange kind of permanence. While they were gradually being repurposed or erased by government policies, nature and time had taken their toll in a way that no human action could fully control. The full economic implications of these fortifications, now surplus, became evident as the years wore on. They were expensive to build, their construction stretching over years, and now they were worthless. No longer seen as symbols of imperial strength, they were reminders of the past, an expensive past that could no longer be afforded. The government's resources were stretched thin with the pressing needs of the post-war economy, and the cost of maintaining or repurposing these sites was simply too high. What had once been essential in an imperial war effort became an economic burden, scrap waiting to be sold, or simply a drain on the resources that the country could ill afford to waste. It was not just the government that faced the pressure of dealing with these abandoned structures. The people of Japan, too, were left to navigate the wreckage of a once proud empire. They faced a national identity crisis, an economic collapse, and the devastation of their cities. Their focus was not on the concrete remnants of military expansion but on survival, rebuilding, and facing the future with as much hope as they could muster. As a result, the bunkers remained nothing more than forgotten relics of a past that the country had to move beyond. Yet, these abandoned bunkers held within them stories that would not be erased. They were a testament to the scale of the war, the vastness of the resources invested, the human labor employed in their construction, and the incredible efforts expended to build them. And despite the fact that the bunkers became obsolete so quickly after the war's end, their presence still haunted the landscape. In the decades to come, they would be discovered again and again by those who sought to understand the conflict's finality, the cost of empire, and the ghostly remnants of a war that, though over, still whispered across the Pacific. As the decades passed, the bunkers began to fade from popular memory, overshadowed by the rapid changes of the post-war world. Yet, in some places, they persisted, silent markers of a time long gone, hidden within the dense overgrowth of islands, waiting to be uncovered by those curious enough to look. In the years that followed the end of World War II, Japan's abandonment of its military bunkers was not merely a logistical necessity but a quiet act of national transformation. These fortifications, once at the core of Japan's defensive strategy, became a symbol of a defeated empire. With Japan's defeat came not just the collapse of its military and political power, but the dissolution of an ideology that had justified the construction of such monumental fortresses. As the country began its difficult journey towards rebuilding and re-entering the global community, these bunkers, once vital outposts in the Pacific theater, fell into a disquieting limbo. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Japan was struggling to cope with the enormity of its post-war reality. The occupation forces, led by the United States, had their own priorities, and they were focused not on clearing out every abandoned bunker but on enforcing the surrender terms. Their main objective was ensuring that Japan would never again become a military threat. The bunkers, remnants of an aggressive empire, were of little interest to the occupying forces beyond their potential to be used for storing supplies or as temporary bases. Most of the massive fortifications, however, were neither of these things. They were monuments to a past that needed to be left behind, and as such, they became increasingly irrelevant. However, the scale of the abandoned bunkers across Japan and its many Pacific islands meant that their fate was far from uniform. In some areas, the bunkers were left to decay as the Allied powers focused their efforts on de-escalating Japan's militarization. Without resources to either tear them down or repurpose them, many bunkers were abandoned entirely. Some of these installations were located in remote islands or dense jungles, where they could go unnoticed, slowly succumbing to the elements. In other places, the bunkers were stripped of their valuable materials. Metals were scavenged, concrete shattered and repurposed, and any military technology or machinery found within these installations was either destroyed or sent to be examined for intelligence purposes. This destruction was often haphazard, a result of a government too overwhelmed by the scale of the task at hand to do it methodically. There was no central plan for dealing with the bunkers, No organized effort to erase them all at once or systematically integrate them into Japan's new identity. The consequence of this disjointed approach was that by the time the 1950s rolled around, many of the bunkers had been left in a state of decay, half dismantled and overtaken by vegetation. Yet some of the more strategic sites, those that could potentially be used again for military or governmental purposes, were preserved, even if only in a rudimentary form. This preservation, however, was often short-lived, as Japan struggled to find the balance between reclaiming its economic viability and maintaining its military posture, which had been severely limited under the terms of its surrender. The nature of Japan's post-war economy was another factor that dictated how the bunkers were dealt with. With the country left in ruins, its economy struggling to recover from both the damage of the war and the demands of occupation, it was clear that resources would have to be directed toward rebuilding the nation's infrastructure. The bunkers, relics of an obsolete military doctrine, were neither cost-effective nor useful in such a context. The economic pressures that Japan faced were immense, and the cost of removing these bunkers, often in remote areas, requiring significant logistical effort, was not something that could be justified. As the years went on, Japan's economy began to recover, especially after the onset of the Korean War, which provided a temporary boost to industrial output. Yet, in the midst of this recovery, the bunkers remained an uncomfortable reminder of a military past that the country was trying to move beyond. They were increasingly seen as something of a national embarrassment, heavy, dark symbols of a regime that had brought devastation to Asia and the Pacific. The government, focusing on domestic stability and international rehabilitation, showed little interest in preserving these sites, much less repurposing them for any useful purpose. Yet, despite the national reluctance to confront these remnants directly, the bunkers took on new lives, in some cases becoming part of the landscape in ways that nobody could have predicted. As the decades passed, the remnants of these fortifications, once the pride of Japan's military establishment, became part of the natural world. In some cases, they were buried under layers of vegetation. In others, they were co-opted by local communities who had no memory of their original purpose but saw in these structures a potential resource, whether it was for materials or simply as shelter in a post-war society where shortages were commonplace. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, as Japan experienced a period of rapid industrialization and economic growth, these bunkers began to fade further into obscurity. The population, focused on rebuilding the nation, had little interest in the decaying remnants of Japan's wartime past. For many, the bunkers were simply part of the landscape, relics of a time that no longer held relevance. However, there was a deepening sense of loss and melancholy tied to them. They stood as mute reminders of the sacrifices made during the war and the misguided ambitions of a nation that had once sought to dominate Asia. As Japan moved into the post-war era, an increasingly globalized world began to look at the island nation with new eyes. The bunkers, once part of a grand imperial strategy, became markers of a divided history. Some, especially those on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, remained places of remembrance, where survivors and their families returned to reflect on the past. These locations, with their sprawling networks of tunnels and bunkers, became sites of pilgrimage for veterans and their descendants. But even in these cases, the bunkers were not preserved for their historical significance. Rather, they were left in their decaying state, with little more than sporadic conservation efforts. In other parts of the Pacific, the bunkers were overtaken by the slow process of urbanization. Islands that once held fortifications were developed into new residential or military bases, but the remnants of the old world could not be erased entirely. For example, in Okinawa, the bunkers and fortifications built during the Battle of Okinawa were left to languish in the jungles and coastal cliffs, often hidden under civilian developments. Over the years, local authorities occasionally sought to preserve certain bunkers as historical sites, but even then, the scale of the remnants far outstripped what could be maintained. In some of the more heavily industrialized parts of Japan, the bunkers found new and rather ironic lives in the post-war economy. Materials salvaged from these fortifications were often recycled into civilian use. Concrete from the bunkers was used to build roads and public works projects, their durability and abundance making them a logical resource in a country struggling to rebuild its infrastructure. Iron, copper, and other metals were extracted and sold to meet the demands of an industrializing nation. The remnants of the past, discarded by their creators, were now being repurposed into the very fabric of Japan's rebirth. But by the 1970s, the last remnants of the bunkers were disappearing. Government efforts to modernize the country had moved on, and the slow decay of these fortifications became a thing of the past. The bunkers' significance as military installations faded, as they were eventually reclaimed by nature, by redevelopment, or by indifference. What remained was a deep sense of historical disconnection, a disconnect that mirrored the broader psychological shift that Japan underwent in the post-war years. The bunkers, monuments to an aggressive past, were left behind in a new, more peaceful era. Yet, even as these sites faded into obscurity, their legacy, while not as visible as it had once been, continued to linger in the collective memory. Many of the bunkers still exist today, hidden beneath dense foliage or interwoven into the fabric of modern cities, waiting for future generations to rediscover them and ponder the stories they contain. They are a stark reminder of a time when Japan's military ambitions stretched across the Pacific and a world was forever changed. The fate of the abandoned Japanese bunkers after World War II was one of slow, inevitable erasure, by neglect, by necessity, and by time. What was once a testament to imperial power was gradually consumed by the processes of history, both natural and human. Yet, in their decay, they stand as symbols of an empire that could not endure, even as the world moved on from the war that had created them.